welcome to this week's installment of DIHowDoI weekly webinar series. Glad to have you all on board. So just a few quick little housekeeping things. Basically, I'm going to have everyone on mute. So if you have any questions, please send them through the chat function via GoToMeeting, or you can email me, DIHowDoI@dealerinspire.com, and I will get those questions answered for you. Also, if you need to duck out for whatever reason, or if this is so awesome you can't wait to watch it again, this webinar will be available on our website within 24 hours, and I'll send out a notice so you guys know when you can go check it out. Also, make sure you check your inbox in about, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes because of magic, and fill out the survey and let us know what you want to see, what you think, how we're doing, all that great stuff. We've been perusing those pretty good and got some great topic ideas. So keep them coming because we want to keep these going. We are now in our 30s. So basically this webinar has moved out of the house and is struggling on its own. So let's keep them going. I want to go to old age with this. So with me today is Scott Dunham, and he is going to talk about responsive web design. So welcome, Scott.
Hey, what's going on? How's everyone doing? Oh, wait, okay.
I can assure you everyone's doing just fine.
Excellent.
Everyone's doing just fine.
Awesome.
So this is Scotty. He's the one, he finished the sandwich, so he's ready to talk to us about responsive web design and, what sets us apart from other dealerships, other website companies, and also just, the function and art of responsive web design.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I'm hopefully going to make you guys kind of aware of what's going on within the responsive idea. And more or less, I kind of geared this towards people who aren't really too familiar with kind of like the history and the background of responsive design and how it became prolific in our industry and kind of like how we kind of implement it in our platform. And so I'm just going to kind of lay these out. So if you're familiar with it, this might seem, a little rudimentary, but for those who aren't familiar with it, this will be kind of like a new thing for everyone. So first things first, though, I don't want anyone to, just let you know that there will be some code that will be involved in this talk.
Dun, dun, dun.
But don't freak out. Don't freak out at all. It's okay. It'll be good. It's not going to like blow your mind or anything else like that. So just bear with me and there'll be some explanation with it. So what is responsive web design? Like what is it? I think a lot of people have an idea of what it is and whatnot. And typically when people do that, it's like, hey, it's where your website is viewable on a bunch of devices, and you can see whatever's going on with that. That's cool, but that's more or less like about what it does, and it's not really essentially about what it is. So if we go to our one trusted source, Wikipedia, they say a site designed with responsive web design, or RWD, adapts the layout to the viewing environment by using fluid, proportion-based grids, flexible images, and CSS3 media queries, an extension of the media rule. Well, that's all well and good, but I think a little bit more about that is again, it's not so much, that's more of like the technical explanation about it. So for example, like if you look at this site, which is just a real simple one, this site is responsive, and oddly enough, that's what it is. And according to their definition, it has a responsive grid that's inlaid to it. Everything's laid out within percentages and so it will flex. There is a media query that is involved with it too. So that means that when it hits a certain width, it's going to go ahead and flex and do something different. And it also has a responsive image in it. But so you're like, well, that's not a responsive website. Like where's the fancy, that doesn't have like this massive images or any video or anything else like that. That's not responsive. But in fact, it really is, because we're really talking about the design portion of it. And that really is what makes it different from everything else, because design does not equal art. That's probably going to, be like, well, what do you mean it doesn't equal art? But here's the reason why. Art is open to interpretation, And design is more or less a means or ways to solve a problem. And that's basically what the design portion of responsive web design is. In fact, Victor Papanek, in his book, Design for the Real World, points out that essentially design is the conscious effort to impose meaningful order. And that's basically what it's really about. It's not really so much about putting things in a certain way to make it flex or fit on a certain device. It's about the actual problem that's being proposed to us. So if we go back to our initial, simple site that we have that has, an image, a sidebar, and some content involved into it, we realize that once we strip out all the artifacts and all the art that's inside of her, what's left is our content. And initially, that's what responsive design was set up to do, is to help us embody our content into our users based on different devices that are available to them. And that's what really Victor Papanek in his book was really saying about it, is that it's a meaningful order of our content that's available to our users and not so much of the art portion of it. So even in Karen McGrain's book, Content Strategy for Mobile, she says the magic trick that we're trying to perform is to get our content ready to go anywhere. And that's essentially what responsive design's problem was to try to solve towards everyone once we started making these devices. So initially, how do we get our content ready for basically anything and everything that we're not aware of? But before we get into that, we have to understand how we kind of got to this point. So we're going to go through a little history lesson first.
Oh, math and history all
I know,
in one.
right?
Wow.
There we go.
All right. All over.
So we're gonna Quentin Tarantino this a little bit. We're gonna rewind, and we're gonna go back to when good old our friend here, Steve-O, had one of those things. He's like, "Hey everybody, look at this cool new device that I have. It's brilliant. It's lovely." He uses a lot of descriptive words to describe the products that he makes, which is great, and it was awesome. And so he introduces this device, this thing, which was basically the mashup between an iPod and a phone. And the cool thing with this is that it actually had a full-scale browser into it. And I'm sure if anyone thinks back from the day, the only thing that anyone really had until the iPhone was released was a BlackBerry, which didn't really have a very functional browser into it like you would on a desktop. Well, the iPhone did. And then he's like, yeah, if you want to go to a website, you just kind of use your little fingers and do the little pin zooming thing, and then you can actually see that. And everyone's like, whoa, that's totally cool. I can actually pin zoom my site. That's awesome. But the problem is with pin zooming on sites that have an extreme amount of content in it. For example, the New York Times, is that it wasn't really that friendly, and it really created kind of a UX problem for a lot of users on the end result, because you would have to pin zoom to see the really, really tiny stuff over there. So that wasn't really a big issue, or that was a really big issue rather. So the solution with that is that we started with what was called the adaptive site, or the MDOT site. I'm sure a lot of people will remember this, where it's like, oh, if you visit a web page on your device or your phone, it would actually redirect you to another one. Here's an example of a site that I made a long time ago for a client, and what they had is you can see here is their actual full-scale desktop site. So that's cool, everything's there. But then if you would visit this site on a mobile device, it would then redirect you to their actual mobile website or their adaptive site, which was pretty cool. You get to sit here, it's got some buttons on there, and it has some selected content that you can see. It also had contact us buttons where if you tapped on a button, it would call them, and that was all really cool. And MDOT sites or adaptive sites were really nice when, you could do that, because it would use device detection to redirect to a separate site. So it's not even part of the actual site. It's something completely different. It has minimal content on it, which was fine because, a lot of that time people weren't really focused on actually transporting their content from one thing to the other. So it was actually dished out in a small way. And it allowed users to get the necessary info that they needed right away. So there wasn't any obstruction or anything else on there. And then on top of it, the cool thing was with these adaptive sites is that it could be applied to any current site without actually having not to rescaffold anything out again. We wouldn't have to really worry about taking what they had, because it was completely broken away from the original site. And this worked fine for a while. But then, our friend Steve comes back and he's like, hey, everybody, look at this other shiny device that I made. Oh, it's so pretty. Look at it. Just look. It's bigger. It's like the iPhone, but it's bigger. And they're like, oh, great, thanks. So now all of the mobile sites that are actually sitting there are now going to redirect to this adaptive site, and it's basically going to look like this. which really doesn't look that good. We have more real estate, more landscape to work with, but it's still using its mobile detection, and it's anytime anyone's going to visit the site, it's going to redirect them to this adaptive site. So this wasn't good because it moved forward and it really meant that mobile didn't really focus in on the phone anymore. It actually was expanding onto tablets and other devices, which was a problem because then users would get the same look as a phone anytime they'd go to your adaptive site. I mean, it just didn't look good. I mean, there's too much real estate and it doesn't really operate very well. And if we wanted to actually target a site that was actually made for tablet, we would have to go through and create a whole nother site. So now we have more sites that are sitting on other ends with other different types of content that are actually disjoined from the original site that was there for content. So meanwhile, this little robot thing starts showing up. And all of a sudden, all these other devices started popping up into the woodwork. Now it's not just so much an iPhone or an iPad, but now we have Galaxy tablets, and we have Android phones, and we have HTCs, and we have Samsungs, and we got Whoosy Whatsits, and Phablets, and even Tag Heuer. They actually made a phone too as well. Can you believe that? But it exists. Just to give you a little bit more of an idea of the fragmentation that's been coming into the device realm, this is kind of going to excuse me, give you an idea of how fragmented a lot of these devices are. So it's just completely like overlaid on top of overlaid. So just to give you just a taste of how different screen sizes are and how we're trying to manage to get our content into those areas. So now this really means that we have a huge design problem for our content, and that's really where this kind of falls into play now. So it wasn't until these two guys, Ethan Marcotte and Jeffrey Zeldman, worked together on the Boston Globe project that they came together and worked on solving the problem to kind of propose a new way of developing websites in order to handle this huge fragmentation that we were having with these devices. Because Android and Apple, they weren't really making websites; they were just making the devices that people would get these content on. And it was Ethan Marcotte that kind of spearheaded the idea of working with this. In fact, he did it so much that he wrote a book called Responsive Web Design through the Book Apart publishing system. And in there, he actually says, rather than creating disconnected designs, each tailored to a particular device or browser, we should instead treat them as facets of the same experience. And that's when he actually coined the term responsive web design. In fact, I think it was at a conference where he actually came up with the term responsive web design. And this wasn't anything that wasn't unknown just yet. Other developers had started to toy around with the notion of using media queries to make them work within designs in order to fit them into the devices. But what it really was coming down was the idea of being device agnostic, meaning that anything, doesn't matter what you had, was able to have your content fit within these devices no matter what. So it wasn't tied down to anything specifically. By definition, again, then Wikipedia kind of laid this out too. A responsive design is anything with a flexible grid-based layout, has flexible images and media, and uses media queries. So to kind of break that down a little bit more, we're going to enter into what's called the flexible grid. That's usually kind of going into what pixels to percentages in order to make things flex a little bit more. So here we go, we got a little bit more code coming up. So for example, this is like just some CSS class that's inside of, that would be inside some CSS. Notice it has a width of 960 pixels. And granted, that's really, really huge, but again, this is for example's sake. But instead of using a fixed width with pixels, what the responsive grid will do is actually change the width into more percentage-based. That will allow it to flex in and out. So for example, if we look at this, we can see that our little sample site here does actually use a responsive-based grid using percentages rather than fixed widths that's inside of there. Now the next portion of this, aside from that, would be the magic of media queries. And so you're probably asking yourself, what is media query? I have no idea what that is. All right, so here we go. Time for a little bit more code. Don't freak out. We're going to get a little bit more deeper into the code portion of it. So a media query basically says inside your CSS that as soon as something hits this certain width, it's going to take that same portion of the code and going to apply a completely different style to it. And what more or less like a media would be considered as a breakpoint. So if as soon as it hits that area, that portion of that screen width, it's going to do something completely different. Now, if we take this example, you notice that as soon as I start to change the dimension of the browser, it will actually go ahead and change the output to something else. And that's basically what a media query does, is that as soon as you see it, it goes to something else. I'm going to do a little quick demo here as well.
So while you're doing that, let me see if I got the basic essence of this. So with the @media query, is that what you call it? Okay. With the @media query and using the percentages, there are basic, and for lack of just in layman's term, I'm gonna call them, you said breakpoints. So let's look at it as like a timeline, and there are breakpoints. So basically the code says, okay, if you reach this base point, which is about the size of a tablet, show this code and make it look like this.
Right.
If we detect that you hit this breakpoint, then it's going to say, oh, wait, hold on. Now we're looking at something a little smaller. Let's pull some different code.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Right.
That's exactly it. And even in this example right here, we can see that we have in our HTML that we have the class of SomeDiv. And that actually has like this title that's inside of it called I'm SomeDiv. And if we look at our CSS a little bit more here, I'll go ahead and bring that up. Here's the original class of just SomeDiv, which is just sitting here. It has this font size and it has a flexible width of 50%. As soon as I start to scale the browser down a little bit more, the grid is going to start to flex. And then as soon as it hits that certain pixel area, then it's going to actually override our previous class of using the font size of 3M and then change it to a font size of 1M and then change the width to 96%. And so, and then if we back it out again, you can see like that kind of goes there and therefore too. So what this does basically is it's telling the browser to say, hey, as soon as you hit this portion right here, do this instead of looking at this the other way. Okay. Which is hugely important because now we're able to responsively scale our content based on the screen size of the device that we're viewing our content on. And that's usually handled more often than not within media queries. Now there's a whole different set of media queries you can use. I mean, there's media and screen, and there's other things too. You can set a min and max width between the two. So if you want to target something in between two different screen resolutions, you can. But that's for a whole nother,
okay.
A whole nother topic at a later date.
Okay.
So that's kind of how a media query works in its very, very basic form. It's like we have one element that we have inside of our web page, and as soon as we, reduce the size of the viewport and start to collapse that down a little bit more, something else changes. And then if we view it on a bigger screen or anything else, it goes back to its original state. So.
Okay. All right. We got a question.
What's up?
Basically, all right. So how do you calculate the size of the media query using AM? So if someone's used to using, pixels, do you set, in your example, you have a max width at 48 AM. So do you set the max width to whatever, like, I don't know, the largest desktop is or something like that?
You can still use pixels if you want. Like, you don't have to use M's. It's just that and if you ever get a chance to read through Ethan's book, the Responsive Web Design book, he'll talk about that a little bit more, is that M's are more of a proportional content-based type of measurement. So when dealing with flexible grids and responsive sites, you definitely want to use M because it's relation to the actual browser or the viewport that you're actually viewing it to rather than pixels, which are fixed width. So pixels will still work. You don't have to not use pixels. If you don't want to. I know in some cases with certain frameworks, they still use pixels, which is fine. Then it still is will still work, and it has actually a better legacy content behind it, because I know sometimes if you use M's as far as text goes on some legacy devices, like IE8, for example, doesn't really read M's too well. Like that's, that's kind of an issue with that. But pixels will still work. It's just M's are a little bit more proportional to what it is, and they're a little bit more flexible for that. And there is a formula that you can use. It's a little bit more robust, and I'm not really going to get into it too much right now, but if you read through Ethan's book, or if you do anything online, and I'll have a link to some resources after this that people can look at, there's ways to do that. So.
Okay, so there are ways to do the conversion from pixels to M's.
Right.
But yeah, okay.
And to kind of go a little bit above and beyond too, is like we build all of our stuff for all of our custom theming on SAS, and there's a Mixin actually you can use, and I don't know if anyone's really familiar with this, but we write all of our CSS in SAS, and then we use a preprocessor to process that out. So we already have a Mixin that we can actually put in a pixel value for that, and then that'll actually generate the M value outside of that too when it's processed out.
Okay.
So I know that's probably a little bit more above and beyond than what some people might know, but that's also available there too. So instead of trying to do all the really crazy math inside of your head, or using a graphing calculator to do it, there are tools out there for our front end development area that we use in order to convert that out if we need to.
All right, awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So yes, so media queries in themselves are somewhat magical. It's magic, isn't it? It's all extreme magic, right? So those are some actual things that are actually kind of make up the blood and guts of most responsive sites. But as you can see, even from our very, very simple site, things can get complex. They can get very, 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 kind of crazy a little bit more. And even looking here, you can see that we have a lot of media queries that are making things do the things that they should do. In fact, even if you look at the Boston Globe site, you can totally see within their areas, and once you inspect a lot of their sources, that they have a ton of complexity going around. And that's one of the caveats that actually responsive web design is kind of lending itself to, is that the more that you actually add to try to compensate for the devices that you're using, the more complex that your sites will become. And it's just a force of nature. It's because we're trying to respond to other devices without really knowing exactly what's going to happen. So within that, creates some complexity, and they can get pretty complex. So there's a couple things you can do in order to kind of help ease that transition into, making sites more responsive. You can either roll your own, which is good, or you can use a framework, and that's cool. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the wonderful world of frameworks, and there's a bunch of them. There's Bootstrap, which is pretty common. There's Zerb Foundations framework, which is actually really cool too. There is the Semantic UI, which is really interesting, as it uses more of a UI-based semantic markup in order to do that. There is Skeleton. There's the one that I've always started off with, which was called Fit Grid, which is just a basic responsive grid for that. And the list can go on and on and on. There are some actual frameworks that aren't really give you a full library to do that. Some of them are all based in SAS, like Bourbon's Neat is another responsive grid framework that you can use if you're using a preprocessor. There's also SUSE. There's tons of them that are out there that keeps going. There are some benefits of using a framework if you want to go that route. Most of the guesswork is done for you. So that's probably the biggest thing ever, is because you don't have to sit there and try to configure your site to respond to certain breakpoints based off of ones, because they've already kind of figured that out. They've taken the most common ones that they can and kind of rolled it up for you in this nice little package that you can just go ahead and implement. Which brings to the next point, is you can just kind of plug and chug with it. You can just go ahead, plug it in, and start chugging away at your code and start getting the site up if you want to. Some of them do come with additional styles for elements like buttons and forms and stuff like that, so you don't have to put in the guesswork or trying to figure out exactly how this is going to work on my site with all these forms. Like, oh, now I gotta create forms. Oh, now I gotta do all the buttons. Oh, well, this framework already has that rolled into. You just put a class in there and you're done. And then another good thing too is that it comes with its own documentation. So if you need to look something up on how something's going to work, you can just go ahead and look it up on their site, and they should have the documentation of how certain things can be implemented and how it's going to look when certain things happen. But there are a few drawbacks to using a framework. One of them is that, unfortunately, it's not yours. Somebody else made it for you. So you're always going to be kind of looking towards them to be like, well, this would be a nice feature to have in my framework. So you either have to add it in or you have to wait for them to update it for you. They can be pretty heavyweight, and they can include some bloated code, which is kind of a caveat to living frameworks because they're putting everything in there. So if you're going to get the kitchen sink, you're going to get the kitchen sink, and that can actually lead to some bloat in the long run. And they also might be hard to customize, like again, since it's not yours, you want to add in a different color to a button, or if you want to change some breakpoints to that, you might run in a couple of roadblocks because, everything should be already set up for you. But if you want to kind of break out of their mold, you're going to have to go in there and configure it yourself, which can be a little tedious and daunting. And then another thing is too, is that, this is something else that somebody wrote. So there's also different versions and conflicts that can come in there. So if you decided to use one and not the other, and you try to implement something that's older versus the newer one, you can have some conflicts and things can break, and it can be kind of a mess after a while. But overall, that's not really a huge thing though. It's like there are some huge benefits to using a pre-built framework, especially if you're wanting to scaffold or get implementation done really quickly. That's a huge bonus. And so if you don't like that, you can definitely roll your own. You can go ahead and create your own framework, which many companies have done. And the benefits to doing that is that it's yours. You made it, you control it, so you have all the time in the world to go ahead and keep adding to it and keep building into it if you want to. You control it. So if you want to make changes on the fly with it, you can. Why? Because it's yours. You can create your own customized elements. So if you're finding that some of the pre-built stuff that's in there isn't really, suited towards your needs at all, you can go ahead and customize it. However, there are some drawbacks as well. The one thing is that it can become isolated. And when I say isolated, I mean since you're doing your own framework, you can kind of retain it into your own self, but then if somebody else might want to use it, it's not going to be able to be portable to something else. So it can only really exist on one thing. So it isolates itself from there. Poor documentation. Again, so you wrote it, you built it, but if you try to hand this off to somebody else, they're not going to know how to do it unless you document what you do, and that can be really poor. And which kind of leads to another thing. It's it might be difficult to train other developers. So if other people are trying to come in and help you out with your application or with your website, and you've rolled out your own framework, you're going to have to lead them hand by hand and step by step to exactly explain them exactly what you did and how you did it. And then this one also runs the risk of possible bloat as well. So, if you don't really maintain it as much as you can, then it can get bloated and pretty heavyweight, much like a regular framework. What is the right way, though? What would be the best way? Honestly, that's completely up to you. Sit down, chat about it, have a beer over it, and just figure it out. Overall, there's no wrong way of doing it, but like anything else, it takes the right tool to do the right job. And so within that, there's some considerations you'd have to make in order to, say well, maybe I might build my own, or maybe we're better off using a framework for this. It really depends on the certain situation of how you want to modify your content to do that. If it's something simple and you don't have a lot of content, yeah, go ahead, make your own framework, no big deal. But if it's something that's going to be pretty heavyweight and you're underneath the time crunch, yeah, then maybe you might need to go ahead and use a framework, or vice versa. So, but for us here at Deal and Inspire, we use Bootstrap for our framework. We kind of made a decision that this would probably be the best way to go. And the reasons for that basically is something that we could easily integrate into our framework. We noticed that, instead of trying to sit there and try to do all the guesswork, we could take something that was widely adopted and go ahead and roll it into our system. Plus, the documentation on it is really, really, really good. So in case we ever needed to have something, change or whatever, we have a question about it, we could easily look that up within there. But more importantly is that it allows us to quickly implement custom layouts into our framework. And I think that's the bigger benefit more than anything else, because, as things get complex and as we have a lot of custom homepage designs, we really wanted something that was going to be stable enough that we could go ahead and implement and get out to our client base in order for them to get to see something as soon as possible. But most importantly, though, is that it helps us solve the problem with making our content and your content accessible to every end user. And so I think in the long run, by using a framework like Bootstrap, that really kind of solved that overall design issue, is making sure that the dealerships or our clients' content that we're trying to build for can be easily accessible and ready to go right out of the box.
Right, but what I'm seeing is that it's also beneficial because our clients are stuck with, your site has to look like this and this is it. Are you about to say that?
Oh, wait.
We are so in sync.
Oh man, it's great. But this is all this is a huge benefit to people at the end user too, for our clients and whatnot, because not only does this allow us to kind of do our job efficiently, but since our platform is built on WordPress and we do have people at dealerships going in and wanting to make some landing pages or any other types of content pages for that, all it really takes for them is to just go ahead and look at the basic Bootstrap documentation, and that'll give them a good overview of exactly what's going on with their site. So I know we've in the past had developed certain things in conjunction with some other people in marketing departments that we've been able to kind of help them set up some things within their site to allow them to actually implement a responsive grid system that we've already basically covered. And then it's just a matter of just taking their content, just plugging it into the editor and making a few tweaks here and there, and then done. It's good. So if we didn't have that, like say we roll our own, then we would have to at least give them some sort of basic, documentation to sit there and say, hey, this is our guidelines and rules and stuff like that. Well, instead, we have this, which is really, really cool, because we want to create that unique feel for everyone, but we also want to make sure that it's working across the board too.
It makes sense, yeah.
So, however, even though that's all well said and done, but with great power comes great responsibility. And that's kind of like the next facet to it. And I'm not going to dive in that too much because we'd be here all day about, things like that. But we also have to be responsible with our responsive design. Having it making our content flex and fit on a bunch of other devices is one thing, but getting it to those devices is a whole other thing. We want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's not really going to be too much overkill. We want to make sure that we're able to get it to older devices as well, because those people are still using those things. And as more and more other countries around the world are starting to get more and more devices and actually networks, those networks are not on 4G or LTE or anything else like that. They're on like 2G networks or 3G networks. And, even in the United States, if you're traveling, and you're in some remote area that might be somewhere and somebody wants to get on your site, you're going to have to try to compensate for that some way. So we also have to be very responsible for what we're putting out there as content as well, and making sure that while we're building and designing these things, that we're conscious and aware of what we're doing with it. And so that's kind of going to wrap it up a little bit more on this one. But before I kind of close out a little bit more, I want to give a little bit more of a story that I kind of noticed one day, and that was back in the day when the Model T was developed by Ford and the Ford Motor Company of creating the assembly line. The Model T was the device for people who could afford to buy a car at a very, very affordable cost. And this allowed people to get from point A to point B at a very, very convenient rate. And the way that it was developed was that we could manufacture these machines, or devices rather, that allows users to go ahead and travel conveniently and quickly, so they wouldn't have to either use their own 2 feet or either take another way of like horse or carriage, or by train rather. So this was revolutionary to our industrialized economy, but as well as to us, because it enabled people to go from to getting knowledge and to go places very conveniently. But the problem existed for the most part is that there was no traffic lights when these cars were created. There was no roads. There was no rules. There was no driver's license. There was nothing. All it was this device that enabled people to do things, to go places, but there were no rules that were set up around it. So it took whole different team of engineers, and it took a whole different team of people to sit there and create things like the stoplight, to create laws and regulations, and to create safety areas so people weren't getting hurt and they weren't dying in these things, because that happened, you know. I mean, there was like fist fights because people would get to an intersection and they couldn't figure out who was going to go first. I mean, that happened. That literally happened.
Still happens.
So, yeah. But the thing is that, you know, it wasn't as much as it was Ford's vision to. He wasn't really responsible for paving the roads, and neither was Steve Jobs for us to implement responsive design. It was up to us to sit there and help us pave the roads for doing things, and it's really up to us to sit there and create a better framework for our content to be streamed out to the end users on the devices that are always going to be manufactured. So, but either way, that's my scoop. That's the deal that I'm going to have on there. I hope that gave some people a basic idea of what's going on. Here's a list of some resources. I'm sure my slides will be up, so if people ever want to see these again, they can. But thanks, I appreciate it. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and they got a little bit of responsive web design ideas out of it.
All right. So. Well, does anyone have any questions? If you do, go ahead and type them in. I know I have one. My first thought that I was thinking, we're talking about tablets and you know, phones and desktops. But wearables, you know, a lot of Apple Watches, you know, Samsung, like, so where, you know, is responsive design, is it there yet for wearables? Is that a whole nother thing? Because now you have even, you know, you have a fraction of the real estate that you would do with the cell phones.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about wearables is that right now, at least for the Apple Watch, it doesn't have an integrated browser on it. So having a website basically be, you know, on a browser inside of an Apple Watch doesn't exist yet. I know on some Android phones it does. I'm sorry, not Android phones, Android wearables it does. So yeah, that's a really new kind of concept, because it seems so funny, because before it was like, oh, we'll just make things really big, and then things got really small, and then things are kind of getting a little bigger in some areas, but then now with the advent of the watch, it's gotten really small, and you know, and even with like the concept of Google Glass, I mean, everyone was like, what do you do with that? I know a while back when Google Glass was really kind of coming around and everyone was kind of like trying to pick it up, even though it's kind of fallen on the wayside now. There was a concept of basically was called no UI, which means that there was no user interface. It was just basically text and commands that you'd be given to it. And so I think as far as like the way that content is kind of being streamed towards those is going to be probably wrapped up in an area where there's very minimal user interface for it. Because essentially when we're trying to get content out to the device, we're wrapping it in some sort of interface that people can kind of tap or click or you know, zoom or do whatever or rotate with that. But when you're getting into more of these devices that don't have a lot of those type of inputs or feedback to them, you're going to have to create an interface that's going to allow for that. So I think as far as wearables go, it'll be interesting to see, because I think we might even have to go to more of a responsive adaptive type of hybrid, where it'll detect based either on the media query that can be pushed in there through like JavaScript to actually give them a completely different interface, because you really can't push that much stuff in there unless you're going to strip a ton of stuff out. So, which is good and bad, but at the same time, like it's really, yeah, there are some caveats to it, but it's in its infancy, so we'll see what happens with it.
Okay. All right. Does anyone have any other questions? All right. Well, if you do come up with some questions and you want to think about it some, you can reach Scott S. Dunham at dealerinspire.com, or you can come through me at DIHowDoI at dealerinspire.com, and I bug him all the time, so I will make sure to get those questions answered for you. So thanks so much for hanging out with us. Just want to let you know that. And this is straight out of the surveys, guys. So we are taking a look at those and making sure we're reading them and checking them out. So our next webinar is going to be with Crystal Mack, who's the editor-in-chief, and we're going to talk about the benefits of model pages. We know they're there. We got the model pages. We're also going to be talking about comparison pages in a couple of weeks, but yeah, but those things are there, and it's like, what the hell do we do this for? Well, there's actually quite a few benefits for them in regards to SEO and visitor, disseminating information to your visitors. So please make sure to check that out next week. And as always, if you have any questions, contact me. Head to dealerinspire.com. You also go to the page DIHowDoI. We got some great stuff there, as where all our past webinars are. We have an FAQ page. So if you have any questions, you can check that out. And hi, Megan, this is you. So please see us next week. And Scott, I want to thank you again for all your knowledge, man. It seems like every time I talk to you, I learn something. So as long as I don't have to pay you, I'm okay.
I don't know. We'll see.
Oh, damn it. All right. Well.
Food works. Food works.
There we go. Sandwiches.
Sandwiches, yes. Can't go wrong with sandwich. So.
How about holograms? We're talking like
Yeah, what do you like? Are you talking about like projected hologram web design?
Are we being punked? Feel a little punked. Hologram web design.
I'm not exactly.
We quite there yet. Is that like
sure.
with like Tupac and Elvis and we can do?
I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, Tupac. Sure.
Yeah, Tupac lives. All right, guys. If you have any questions, lay them on me, and we'll get them answered.
I think the best way to do hologram web design would be with ASP.NET. So yeah, you probably want to use ASP.NET.
Definitely ASP. I was thinking the same thing.
Totally ASP.
Yeah.
That'd be the best way to do it.
All right, you heard the man. ASP.NET. All right. Again, I'm Shawnee, the trainer of technologies for innovative dealers such as yourself, and I will see you all next week. Thank you so much.